The daughter-in-law of the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding Prime Minister, has been found guilty of a grossly improper conduct in her professional duties as a lawyer. This in relation to how she handled Mr. Lee's final will. A disciplinary tribunal found Mrs. Lee Suet Fern's breaches serious enough to be referred to the Supreme Court.
The tribunal found that senior lawyer Mrs. Lee Suet Fern was in serious breach of her duties regarding the final will. Mrs. Lee's 6 previous wills were prepared by lawyer Ms. Kwa Kim Lee, niece of Mr. Lee's late wife. They were executed from 2011 to 2012. The final will was signed almost a year later. 4 days before it was signed, Mr. Lee had discussed with Ms. Kwa that he wanted to change his 6th will to give his children equal shares and to leave Mr. Lee Hsien Yang, Mrs. Lee's husband, with 2 carpets. However, the will was entirely revoked when Ms. Kwa was away. Mrs. Lee Suet Fern and her husband arranged for a new will signed urgently, within 16 hours of Mr. Lee seeing the draft. Mr. Lee Hsien Yang had told his father not to wait for Ms. Kwa, removing her from the email chain even before Mr. Lee agreed. Mr. Lee Hsien Yang and his wife then had lawyers from his wife's firm to help execute the will. Mr. Lee was 90 years old and in poor health, having been hospitalized. The tribunal found that he agreed to sign his last will based on his trust in Mrs. Lee Suet Fern. She had misled Mr. Lee on the contents of his last will, saying it was his first will. This was false. Mrs. Lee also didn't take him through the terms and focused only on executing the will with undue haste. She also didn't advise him that she had reinserted a demolition clause in the last will and made other changes. Mrs. Lee was also indicted for failing to advise Mr. Lee to get independent advice. This was essential since her husband was going to get a gift under the will. Instead, she managed every step of the process with her husband's active involvement. The tribunal said serious questions were raised over the couple's motives. Other than the account by the couple who had lied on other evidence, there was no evidence as to why Mr. Lee decided to disregard his discussion with Ms. Kwa, revoke his 6th will, and choose his first will, which had been superseded by 5 others.
According to the Legal Profession Act, the court of 3 judges will decide if Mrs. Lee Suet Fern may be disbarred, suspended, penalised up to $100,000, censured, or a combination of these. Now, the disciplinary tribunal said lawyer Lee Suet Fern and her husband Lee Hsien Yang were deceitful in the explanation of their conduct. It said the pair presented an, quote, elaborate edifice of lies, both on oath and through their public and other statements.
Improbable, patently contrived, and downright dishonest. Words used by the tribunal in its over 200-page long report. It said the facts expose an unsavory tale. The late Lee Kuan Yew, who was very frail and in poor health then, had been misled by the very people he trusted, his son and daughter-in-law. In her closing submission, Mrs. Lee denied she was the late Lee Kuan Yew's lawyer for the last will and argued there was no implied retainer. She said she was helping as a family member and did not give or take instructions from her father-in-law, who had access to his own lawyer at all times. Mrs. Lee also argued that if she was in a position of conflict of interest, the late Mr. Lee was fully aware of her involvement and chose to proceed. But the tribunal said that both Mr. Lee Hsien Yang and his wife had lied in public and private forums about how the last will was drafted and who drafted it to suppress their central role in what had happened. These stretch back to 2013, claiming that Mrs. Lee did not draft the last will when in fact she did and advised the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew on it. Lying that it was his usual lawyer, Kwa Kim Lee, who had drafted the last will, and then accusing her in public when she disputed this. The tribunal also noted that the pair had tried to suppress evidence from them. Mrs. Lee falsely stated that she had disclosed all relevant documents, when in fact she was deliberately holding back those which were damaging to her. This, the tribunal said, was in breach of her legal duty. Mr. Lee Hsien Yang had tried but failed to make an application that would have prevented the Law Society from relying on various documents, including the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's previous wills. Despite this, Mrs. Lee still tried to stop the tribunal from obtaining those documents. Concluding its lengthy report, the tribunal said Mrs. Lee was a deceitful witness, tailoring her evidence to portray herself as an innocent victim who had been maligned and lied whenever she thought it was to her benefit. It said Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's conduct was equally deceitful, as he also lied to the public, ministerial committee, and the tribunal. It added that he had no qualms about making up evidence as he went along.
Mrs. Lee has responded to the tribunal's findings that she is guilty of misconduct and said that she disagrees with its report and intends to, quote, fight this strongly when it is heard in open court. Her comments were posted today on the Facebook page of her husband, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Now, the Oxley Road saga lies at the core of the case. The long-running spat over the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's house first surfaced in the public eye on Facebook 3 years ago. The case is part of a public dispute that first came to light in 2017. Back then, the late Mr. Lee's two younger children, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and Dr. Lee Wei Ling, issued a 6-page statement accusing Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong of using his position to drive his personal agenda, one that involved going against his father's wishes to demolish the house. PM Lee rejected the allegations that same day. A ministerial committee was formed separately to consider options for the house. It released its report in 2018 with recommendations to help a future government make an informed and considered decision when the need arises. A year later, the Attorney General's chambers raised the issue of professional misconduct to the Law Society of Singapore. The AGC asserted that Mrs. Lee Suet Fern's role in the preparation of the late Mr. Lee's last will placed her in a position of conflict, as her husband, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, is among the beneficiaries under that will. The AGC said this was a breach of conduct. The last will had also contained a clause to demolish Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's residence at 38 Oxley Road. The AGC added that it had written to Mrs. Lee for an explanation but received no reply.